Well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for America First Policy Institute's second annual Back the Blue gathering. And before I continue, let me recognize that we have Congressman Ronnie Jackson in the crowd. Where's Congressman? Oh, there he is. Front row. I knew we sat you in the front row, so great. Well, we hold this event each year during National Police Week to honor the men and women of law enforcement who have lost their lives in the line of duty. As many of you have undoubtedly seen in the past few days, literally thousands of police law enforcement officers from around the nation, federal, state, and local, descend upon our nation's capital to pay their respects to their fallen brothers and sisters. Accompanying them are countless family members and friends who mourn not just the officers who have died, but their fathers, their mothers, their sisters, and brothers who meant so much to them and their communities. I've seen and felt that pain up close during my tenure as Acting Secretary of Homeland Security, overseeing the largest federal law enforcement agency in the country. The weight of those losses became profoundly personal with each notification of an officer's death, deepening further when I met with their grieving colleagues and their family members. In honor of all of those officers who have lost their lives and in support of those who continue to grieve, please join me now in a moment of silence. Thank you. At AFPI, we work tirelessly to support the men and women who risk their lives to protect our communities. And we do this in the best way that we know possible, and that's by developing and advocating for public policy that improves public safety, improves the working conditions for our nation's police officers, and improves the ability of each and every American citizen to live their lives in a safe and secure community, free from the victimization by society's criminal element. Sadly, not all communities, though, enjoy that same commitment to law and order from their local elected officials. Over the past few years, we've seen even more and more jurisdictions, large and small, elect rogue progressive prosecutors who have implemented backward policies that place criminals first and victims last. And so they do this under the guise of social justice, but all they manage to do is inspire more crime, more social decay, and ultimately more dangerous and difficult working conditions for our nation law enforcement officers. You'll find at your seat AFPI's latest public policy on this issue, a booklet containing information on 5 of the country's most egregious rogue progressive prosecutors. Their policies are endangering their communities and undermining the effective administration of justice. And make no mistake, social justice advocates who infiltrate the criminal justice system with naive claims that their soft on crime approach to justice will actually reduce crime are selling the American people a false bill of goods. And that is large part of why we're here today to discuss. Today's event, Countering the Left's Assault on Public Safety, accurately captures the troubling developments we've observed over these past several years. But more importantly, the critical question we aim to address is how can we effectively counteract these perilous policies and ensure the safety and security of our communities. First, we need to call them out when we see them. The American people have a right to know if their leaders in local criminal justice system are helping or hurting their communities. And at AFPI, we've released over 20 papers, countless op-eds, model policies to do just that, and we'll continue that action going forward. Second, we need to discuss ways to improve public safety and also improve the safety and working conditions of our brave law enforcement officers. It's not enough to simply say we support our nation's police officers. We must turn that talk into action by supporting and implementing policies that do just that. And that's what we aim to accomplish this evening. We've assembled an impressive panel of speakers, each of whom brings with them decades of experience that they've given to, that gives them the authority to discuss all of these issues this evening. To introduce each of our panelists and to moderate today's discussion is the director of AFPI's Center for Law and Justice, Scott Erickson. Now, I've known Scott and I've worked closely with him for several years, and he's uniquely qualified to lead the discussion this evening. Scott's a 20-year veteran law enforcement officer of San Jose, California, and joined me at the Department of Homeland Security, both as my Deputy Chief of Staff as well as my Principal Law Enforcement Advisor. So please help me in welcoming Scott to the stage.
Thank you, Chad, for your remarks, and thank you to everyone for joining us here this afternoon. As Chad mentioned, this is an important week for law enforcement. It's important for our community. It's not just a time of reflection on the men and women we've lost in the line of duty, but also a time to reflect upon how we can better support those who carry on. We do have a great group of panelists here today, and it's my honor to introduce them now. Our first panelist, the Honorable Pam Bondi, hails from Tampa, Florida, and has had a distinguished career in the field of law, serving for more than 18 years as a prosecutor. She served as the state attorney for the 13th Judicial District of Florida, where she was the district's lead prosecutor, pursuing justice for victims and holding perpetrators accountable for their actions. During her career, Pam has tried all manner of cases, including multiple capital murder charges. She was subsequently elected as Florida's 37th and first female Attorney General in 2011, a position she held until 2019. She now leads AFPI's efforts as the chair of our Center for Litigation, and she is also the co-chair of AFPI's Center for Law and Justice. Pam Bondi. The Honorable Matt Whitaker is a lifelong Iowan with decades of experience in the legal profession. In addition to lettering in football, Matt earned his BA, MBA, and JD from the University of Iowa. Matt took that education and applied it to the public good. He served as the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Iowa from 2004 to 2009, and more recently he served as the acting U.S. Attorney General between 2018 and 2019. Prior to that, he served as the Chief of Staff for the Attorney General at the DOJ. Now at AFPI, Matt co-chairs the Center for Law and Justice. Matt Whitaker. The Honorable Doug Collins. Doug's exposure to law enforcement came early on in life, with his dad being a Georgia State Trooper. His life of service also began early on, as he pursued advanced degrees in both divinity and the law, subsequently joining the United States Air Force Reserve, serving as a chaplain, and having been deployed to Iraq in 2008 and 2009. He remains active as a colonel in the U.S. Air Force today. More recently, Doug spent nearly a decade as a United States Congressman representing Georgia's 9th Congressional District, culminating with his tenure as the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee, overseeing the administration of justice within the federal courts, administrative agencies, and federal law enforcement entities. Doug currently serves as the chairman of AFPI's Georgia State chapter. Doug Collins. The Honorable Dan Muser has represented Pennsylvania's 9th Congressional District since 2018. Growing up the son of a police officer, Dan was instilled with a strong work ethic that he took with him into the workforce, helping turn a small healthcare products manufacturer into the worldwide industry leader in power mobility products. Now in Congress, Dan currently serves on the House Financial Services and Small Business Committees. He's also a member of the Republican Study Committee, the Problem Solvers Caucus, the Border Security Caucus, and the Congressional Coal Caucus. Dan and his wife Shelley have 2 daughters and a son and live in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania. Please welcome Dan Muser.
So thank you again, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Congressman, for coming as well. Pam, I want to begin with you, and I'm going to ask this question down the line to everybody, but generally, what does Police Week mean to you, and why is it important for us as a community to remember and reflect upon the sacrifice of the law enforcement community?
Well, as you said earlier, I was an assistant state attorney for 18 years before I ran for Attorney General. And one of my dear friends was murdered in the line of duty, Ricky Childers. I was a homicide prosecutor. And my last memory of Ricky was sitting in the front row of the courtroom. We were arguing a motion in front of the judge prior to a murder trial. And he was talking about his wife, Vicky, who was also a friend of mine, and how much he loved his wife and his 2 sons, and telling me family stories. And then just like that, he was gone. He and his partner, Randy Bell, were murdered by a horrible convicted felon who was on the run. And that was my first experience, truly losing a friend and finding out every day what police officers do for us. Not only in Tampa, but of course around the country. And that's why it's so important that we back the men and women in blue, because I always say there is no ordinary day in the life of a police officer. When Randy and Ricky were murdered, it was like 10:30 in the morning on a weekday. Can you imagine? They had just left their wives. Morning, 2 homicide detectives, 2 who usually are safer, you know, because they're not uniformed officers, gunned down by a convicted felon. So that's why I think it's so important that today, this week, Police Week, is so important. And since then, as Attorney General, I've been to countless law enforcement officer funerals throughout the state of Florida, and it's just gut-wrenching.
Matt?
Well, I think it's so important that we take this time and recognize the sacrifices of the men and women of law enforcement. It's always more and more impactful. When I was the Attorney General, we lost a deputy U.S. Marshal serving a search warrant. Always seems to be like a very risky situation, and it rips your heart out. Calling his wife and offering your condolences and attending funerals and those are really, really hard. But I also think that we need to communicate to law enforcement that we have their backs, that when something awful happens, that we are there as a community supporting them, supporting their families, and doing more than just talking about it. We are there to make sure that that law enforcement continues to be a noble profession, that we defend the men and women of law enforcement whenever and however we can. Because again, without law enforcement, without law and order they provide, I think human nature would have us in a much different place than having our communities safe and protecting our lives and everything that law enforcement does.
For me, it's really easy. It's not Law Enforcement Week for me. It's been almost 58 years of Law Enforcement Day because my father was a Georgia State Trooper for 31 years, and I still have him. He's still alive. He's the 6'2", 250-pound grumpy state trooper from Georgia is now a 6'2", 250-pound granddad. I'm not sure what happened to my dad, but he was there. But it made an impact on me because I watched what he did every day. And I would remember him coming home with a uniform tore. I remember blood on his shirt. I remember him coming and sitting down to dinner with us and getting a phone call that he had to go work a wreck or something had happened. And what you said and what Pam and Matt have said is it's an everyday experience and nothing is normal. And yet watching him and watching his fellow officers who were big brothers to me, they were older, and seeing that every day, it reminded me that we often focus on the officer, and we need to, and Law Enforcement Week does that, and I'm so glad that we do. But really for law enforcement, we also need to make sure that we include the families in that as well, because the families are such a large part. They sacrifice like the officers do, and to have good ones out there. I hear this all the time, and Matt made we had to encourage them and come on to side our law enforcement officers because they want to be the best that they can be too. They're just like everybody. There's some that shouldn't be in law enforcement, but the vast, 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 vast majority of them are the ones that keep us safe. And they're the ones that we need to support, and we need to make it to where they are valued. They understand that their life is put on the line, but they're doing it for us. And so for me, I've always looked at this as a bittersweet week. We remember those who've lost their lives, but we also remember the very profession that I've had the privilege of watching for almost 58 years, and that is service before self. That is someone who goes out and gives. And so for me, I see a picture of a person, and I hope everyone in here does as well, not just somebody who rides in a car.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, appreciate being here with this panel. And like Doug, I come from a law enforcement family. It's been a while back when my dad retired, actually NYPD, retired as a detective. But it's what you grow up with, and you see it. You see the dedication. You hear them speaking when you're supposed to be asleep about what happened that day and the challenges. And it's unfortunately, I think, a lot different today. I mean, I don't think it. I know it. We had some police officers in my office this afternoon. I attended this morning a ceremony in the southern part of my district in Pennsylvania for Lieutenant William Lebo, who we were just able to name the local post office after. We got that through, but It wasn't for all that much of a celebration, because Lieutenant Lebo, after 40 years on the force, 2 years ago, entered a home where there was a domestic dispute, told 2 of his guys to stay back. He was going to retire, by the way, within 30 days, and he was shot and killed. And he was just a community leader. Now, the thing is that, look, as Doug mentioned, maybe 0.5%, maybe 0.1%, maybe it's 1% of the officers that are on the force need improvement, need additional training, or just don't belong there. But what was important is that, and that's what's important about this week, and the police really appreciate it. Law enforcement really appreciate this week, that we don't lose respect, and that needs to be 100%. And that's something that we have to work on as a society. We have to have 100% respect for law enforcement, or else that thin blue line doesn't work. So that's why I think we're here, and that's why we're going to continue to support them.
Yeah, thank you all for that. And Congressman, you make a good point that times are changing. And as Chad mentioned, I had spent about 20 years in law enforcement in San Jose, and just last week, 2 of my former colleagues were shot and 1 critically injured. Fortunately, I think they're both going to survive. But I talked to another colleague, and she was telling me that in the past year, it seems like more cops in San Jose in particular have been shot or shot at than we've seen in 10 years. So people are just, there's a lack of respect for the law, and it's manifest in a very dangerous way for law enforcement. Chad also mentioned the Rogue Prosecutor book that you all have, and I think that's a big part of what we're here to talk about, is not just supporting law enforcement, but what can we do to make sure that the right policies are being put out there to help them. And what these rogue progressive prosecutors are doing is the exact opposite of that. Congressman, I know you've taken a leading role in Congress in trying to address this phenomena, and you have a bill that you introduced earlier this year, the Holding Prosecutors Accountable Act, H.R. 6999, that would essentially require prosecutors to meet a certain charging threshold in their office if they were to apply for burn grants through the DOJ. I want you to tell us a little more about that and what motivated you to put that out there.
Thanks, Scott. Well, what motivated me was that in cities with very high crime rates, like my beloved Philadelphia, frankly, we have a district attorney that is prosecuting violent crimes, prosecuting less than 30% of those charged with violent crimes. And in the bill, we itemize what those violent crimes are, just to make it as clear as possible. And in the cities where crime is minimal, same size cities, the district attorneys are prosecuting violent criminals above 70%. And that's the way it used to be in Philadelphia years back, and that's where it used to be in most cities. Think of that. We have a district attorney up there in Philadelphia by the name of Larry Krasner, whom just simply won't prosecute violent criminals. Frankly, it's a left-wing social experiment taking place, and it's failing miserably. So we passed this bill. Just last week, I participated in a Judiciary Committee hearing in Philadelphia, led by Jim Jordan and a number of others, and they invited me on. I'm not in Judiciary, and we had witnesses that one lost their son, who was a police officer. Another witness lost her husband. 2, those who were charged within the last 6 months, more than one charge of illegal gun possession. And yet here they were out on the streets. And again, Larry Klasner, our district attorney there, did not prosecute. So they truly feel that these tragedies, these beyond tragedies, these murders of these wonderful people could have been avoided with the proper level of prosecution. So if they don't maintain that level of 67%, they can lose various types of funding. So hopefully it helps correct things.
Yeah, no, it's
Can
great.
I add one thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
2 things, actually. I think about the programs we had when I was a U.S. attorney, and then we brought them back. when I was at Maine Justice called Project Safe Neighborhoods, which took, federal gun crimes, federalized these felons in possession, these illegal gun possessions, and actually gave real time. One of the biggest challenges here in the district is that the prosecutor's not doing felons in possession and not federalizing those cases and not getting significant, prison time for these folks. And I think the other thing, Congressman, that I'm sure that and that one of the hopefully outcomes of a bill like that would be, the law enforcement officers are actually out there arresting these folks, and then seeing them right back on the street. In these progressive districts, they always seem to have also progressive judges that don't want to hold anybody pre-trial, and I think that's also a major challenge for law enforcement right now.
It's all a good point, and you're talking about prosecutors and judges, and I've always said the arc of the criminal justice system has to be functional, all of it, not just the law enforcement, the police up front, but the prosecutors, the jails, and all that has to all be working in order for us to achieve public safety or some semblance of it. But Pam, on this topic, you're no stranger to progressive prosecutors and the fallout and the spillover effect of crime. You were a prosecutor yourself for a long time. You were the Attorney General, and I know, you had some experiences with some folks who were progressive prosecutors in Florida,
Oh, yeah.
one of whom who might have been removed by Governor DeSantis last year. But I'd like you to tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, and first, before we talk about how bad Andrew Warren is, there was, you think Florida, we're conservative, right? We're so conservative, we're so law and order. And Congressman, it's what you said, it's like some kind of sick social experiment. Let these people run for public defender. Why are they running for state attorney in Florida? It makes no sense, other than the Soros family-backed experiments around the country. I truly don't understand why they're doing it. I don't. But yeah, we had one when I was Attorney General in Orlando who just refused to prosecute certain murder cases. So I went to Rick Scott when he was governor. We removed her from every homicide case and gave them to my statewide prosecutors. And the conviction rate, of course, went through the roof. And yeah, one of them was a police officer, I can still see her laying there, who was gunned down in the line of duty. And it was just unbelievable, remarkable why you couldn't support even considering to seek the death penalty on someone who gunned down a police officer. And then most recently is Andrew Warren. He was a state attorney in Hillsborough, and Governor DeSantis removed him from office for sheer lack of duty. He was letting murderers out of prison. He was letting my murderers out of prison without even talking to the victims' families. It's unbelievable. So the governor removed him. I signed an amicus brief supporting that. And then Susie Lopez, a former colleague of mine, she was appointed state attorney. She gave up being a judge because she cares so much about our county. Yet now, guess who's running against her currently? Andrew Warren. So that's why getting involved in local races is so very, very important to law and order. But and to Matt's point, how do we support our law enforcement officers if the prosecutors don't have their backs? Then who is going to support them?
Yeah, I want to take a step on that, Pam. I think you've hit something very well, but I think the reason is because they understand in our criminal justice system. I mean, anybody who just watches Law and Order, they understand. They started the police investigated the crimes, the prosecutor. It's a system, but they understand something. The prosecutor, and I don't want to make this very clear. The prosecutor has a unique place in the criminal justice system, and the prosecutor actually has a higher standard of charging because they actually carry the power of the state. They actually carry the power of government to take away your liberties. So that is actually a higher ethical standard to do that, not only from the reverse of charging, but also not charging if there is a reason not to. We see this happening on the national scene right now with a certain former president. But, they go after what they want. But if you take a law and you can then go in, if I just open the book and say, here's a law, and I say, well, let me see if I can fit you into that law or you into that law. That's not prosecuting. That is being selective, and that is an agenda. The other part, though, that actually takes that out further, and I think, Pam, I'm glad you brought this up, was that is, again, the touch point of local elections. We get so caught up in we talk about supporting our police in Congress, and we do that, and the bill is great, and other. But actually, when the real life hits the road, it's the local DAs, it's the local judges, it's the local solicitors in many cases that are the ones that are actually prosecuting the cases or not. And we're going to talk about it a little bit later, how that actually affects the willingness for law enforcement to be in communities. But again, never deny that the prosecutor has a much higher standard in how they're to charge and how they're to conduct themselves, because they carry what we have given to them is one of our most valuable powers, and that is the ability to take your freedom away.
That's a great point. And Doug, I want to kind of stay on that theme real quick with you. You're talking about the politicization of the judicial system. And when you were in Congress, there was a sort of an infamous case in Georgia with the Fulton County DA before Fonnie Willis, Paul Howard. And there was a shooting where 2 officers in Atlanta were involved in a shooting, and an individual died. And the DA there decided to charge the officers before the Georgia Bureau of Investigation even completed their investigation. And the former congressman, called on that individual prosecutor to step aside and allow an independent prosecutor to come in. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, this one shows you the effect of a politicization of your DA's office. Okay, Paul Howard. If anybody thought that or thinks that Fonnie Willis is bad, they've never met Paul Howard. They would have a running battle to see who probably is the least competent of the two. Paul was a long-term DA, been there for many, many years. And he was in a race, and I can't make this up. He was in a race against, guess who? Fonnie Willis. He was getting beat. And this was around the time of all the turmoil in going across the country, and then there was this shooting, and the officers had went and responded. And anyway, the 2 officers were charged before the investigative report ever came back. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation does the police shootings, and that's how so it takes it out of the local. But they came in. They were not even through with their report. Now, I'm going to have to go forward here. It was actually Fonnie Willis who actually finally had to drop the cases. That shows you how bad this was. But the only reason he did it was because he was trying to please a voter base. This is a concern when you get into the politicization of a DA's office and in a court system in which no one else held the key. Nobody else can go. Actually, in Georgia, we're getting better. We don't have this. We've just started to get in the position to where DAs can be removed. We were in a position where, unless it was a actual crime committed, you were in real gray area. That's why some of the laws have been passed in Georgia over the recent years. But this shows you what can happen. So think about this. For any of you in here who is maybe in law enforcement, you have family in law enforcement, how would you like to be a law enforcement agent in Fulton County, Georgia? And they have multiple cities. So it's not, you can be in Alpharetta, you can be in Roswell, you can be in the city of Atlanta, but at the end of the day, the felony cases are going to go through the DA in Fulton County. So you have Paul Howard, who chose a political route. It was all it was. Nobody, it was universal, even among folks there. You don't even have the case. You don't even have the investigative report back. You don't have anything, and he goes ahead and bypasses grand jury and charges. Think about just the idea of that he has taken away personally the freedom of officers to do their job. And in doing so, put them at risk because they become. My dad told me this one time. He said, there's nothing worse than a scared officer. And I thought about that for a little bit, but it's true. A scared officer who goes out is one that's going to hesitate. Because if they're not sure they're backed up, if they're not sure they can do it, they may cause that 1 second of hesitation, which could cost them their life. And when you have a DA who is actually charging police officers instead of supporting police officers, or at least doing the job, you could have at least maybe if the GBI report came back and said, yes, this was an egregious violation, the officers need to be charged, that's one thing. But they did it before the investigation was even finished. Well, we thought that maybe something would change in Fulton County, and Paul Howard was defeated by Fonnie Willis. History often doesn't repeat, but it definitely rhymes in Fulton County.
Yeah, that sort of the perversion of justice, sort of at the altar of social justice, and all these sort of anti-police, this anti-police narrative. And Matt, it's a great example of how that culture again has perverted justice, but also I think inhibiting good men and women from joining law enforcement. And we're dealing with a generational crisis in recruiting and retention. And I know you've had experience dealing with law enforcement at all levels, federal, state, and local, for decades. What are you seeing, hearing, and from the folks in the street about not wanting to get into the job?
Right. Well, it bears out in the numbers. Unfortunately, especially in some of these more progressive districts, you have a lot of retirements. I think about in places like Portland, Seattle, where they cannot maintain numbers, where service levels are under what they should be, where times to get to a call are desperately inadequate, and that's not the law enforcement officer on the street. Their fault. I mean, it's the fault of the political leadership. And I say this all the time. Really, when we took over in 2017 and went out and really delivered a different message from Washington, D.C. than they had heard in the 8 years before, which was, we have your backs and you have our thanks. And that tone from Washington was felt across the entire nation among law enforcement. And it's gone away again. And, we're going to have to return that and restore that. But some of this is really the biggest challenge is just getting law enforcement to be a profession that people want to pursue and want to seek out, and to make sure that we're getting the best possible candidates for our academies, that we're training them with the best possible procedures and policies and training, and then making sure that they're adequately staffed. I mean, if you don't get enough to some of these calls now and these horrific carjackings, or I think in Washington D.C. they average 3 a day of carjackings, and these are violent carjackings where a former Afghani interpreter who moved his family to Washington D.C. for a better life was carjacked as an Uber driver and shot and killed. Not too far from here, actually. And this is the kind of thing that we need to make sure that we have adequately funded, adequately staffed, and adequately trained law enforcement. And it's the failure of the politicians in these major cities in America that are causing all of those challenges in law enforcement. And until until the voters in those districts speak up and let them know that we want to be safe. We want our children to be able to play in their front yard without getting hit by stray bullets. We want a neighborhood where we can go for a walk at night and not be worried about being accosted. All of these things are really systemic from the left's radical policies. And it to some extent you can say it came out of George Floyd in the summer of 2020, but really there's more to it. There's really to the point of the congressman and others, there's just an experiment going on right now in some of our communities that is failing those citizens, and they're going to have to speak with one voice and speak out as to what they want, which is they want adequately staffed and well-paid law enforcement officers that are encouraged to do their jobs.
Doug, did you have something?
I think it's just an example. I want just a real quick one here. For those of you sitting right here, for those who've been in Washington, D.C. for a long time, if you went left out of the Capitol Hill, you went down that way. If you were here 15, 16, or like I was in 87 as an intern, you went that way, it was a war zone. You went to Navy Yard, back then that was a war zone. And then all of a sudden they started building, and in the last 10 years it's become high-rent apartments and everything else, and now look at what you're seeing. You look at the police blotters, it's the hijackings, it's the carjackings, and it's because you have a police force here and a mayor who absolutely has turned their back on public safety and have taken what was being a very good thing and is now reversing itself again. And I think, Matt, what you just said is so important. We can't keep going backwards here.
Yeah, and recruiting and retaining police officers. And if you think about the worst districts, like poor NYPD, can you imagine being an NYPD officer right now? Can you imagine that, being in that department? But look at the common denominators. Weak mayors and weak police chiefs in all of those cities.
It's interesting, we bring up D.C., and obviously there is a crime issue here, and as you mentioned, yeah, it's all relative. Of course, this is in the 1980s, but it doesn't have to be like it doesn't have to be like this. It can be like it was 4 or 5 years ago when it was a lot safer. And D.C. is unique as a federal district. And Congressman, you very familiar with the D.C. crime bill that the city council passed last year, and Congress actually overrode it. So Congress does have unique authorities here to try and right some wrongs when the local politicians kind of go off the rails in that. So any comments on that behind the scenes?
Yeah, let me just start with the problem, as you can hear and you know, because you're living it, you see it, is very deep, right? I mean, here you have a police force that's been defunded. Fact, Washington's defunded by $60 million from 660 to 600 over the last 4 years. Philadelphia has also been reduced by about 10%. But then, just over the last 4 years, but then you have police officers that are also demoralized and demonized. They have a question about the immunity status of the qualified immunity, right? So qualified immunity is if there were a fight outside, and I went over, even as a member of Congress or of you, broke it up, and somebody fell and maybe broke their elbow, you could be liable, right? You could be sued. But imagine, by removing qualified immunity, imagine a police officer is now also liable in that case. That's what removing qualified immunity does. That's absurd. You can't have that. And that's why it's very difficult to even speak to a police officer these days that feels very motivated about their work. They know what they're there for, to protect and serve. But they feel as if they are in fact demonized, and put on top of that how they are gone after by those same prosecutors when something like that occurs, right? And as well as the media. So the reason this is important, and for AFPI to be putting on this forum, and frankly, I'll say it, to have a president that is clearly 100% always on the side of the men and women in uniform that are protecting our streets, and that is Donald Trump. That message is so important, is to set that tone from the leadership. Because you want to know what? Public safety is the most important function of government. How can we have so many leaders, as Pam said, that are supported by the George Soros and his family, right? Who pay millions of dollars for prosecutors that don't prosecute. And you want to know what? That same Soros family donates to other elected officials here in Congress. I'll say it, Democrats. So that's just wrong. And we need to stop this trend. These smash and grabs, migrant crime. And let's face it, this is nuts. That's occurred over the last 4 or 5 years. Do you know of my 8-person staff, 3 of them were held up at gunpoint in the last 3 years? Carjackings are up over 100% here in D.C. So this has got to come to a head. We've all got to be on board with it in every way, shape, or form. And it comes from prosecutors supporting the police, giving them the tools they need to protect and serve, and it requires universal support.
On the first day of the Trump administration in 2017, he issued 3 executive orders to the Department of Justice. The first one was back the blue, support the men and women of law enforcement. The second one was reduce crime in America. And the third one was dismantle transnational criminal organizations. Fairly clear leadership.
Yeah, leadership, you can't underscore how important leadership is from the top down and how it affects and impacts officer behavior on the street as well. I can tell you from personal experience, it certainly does. And Congressman, you mentioned qualified immunity. You're a co-sponsor of the Qualified Immunity Act of 2023, which was also introduced in the 117th Congress and here in the 118th as well. And Matt, if you don't mind, if you talk a little bit more about qualified immunity. I think it's an important doctrine, an important concept that a lot of people don't understand, and why it's important to law enforcement. And of course, with the advent of the anti-police movement, or the burgeoning anti-police movement in 2020 and on, there have been a lot of people who've tried to get rid of that. And some states have even done that. But Matt, please talk a little bit more about that from a legal perspective, why it's important, and perhaps from practical experience.
Yeah, well, it's obviously what we're looking at is how to protect law enforcement officers from frivolous lawsuits and from potential liabilities. And one of the ways is it's a presumption. It's a presumption that if you're a law enforcement officer, doing your duties, then any act you do in that, you are presumed to have acted lawfully and within the scope. But it's certainly a presumption that can be eliminated if you acted illegally or inconsistent with the law or your training. And I think it's the idea of getting rid of that, where all of a sudden it's going to be a coin flip, sort of as each act that an officer takes, that's a slippery slope to having no police officers. And if we have a problem with recruitment, retention, and now it's only, that'd be a game over situation.
Yeah, I'm going to add on to that, Matt, because what you said is true. And think about that. Think about if you're an officer on the street and basically take an action and judged by the DA in your district or your others in that district, it's a flip of the coin to say, okay, is this going to be perceived subjectively as something I should do or not do? Again, that goes back to the scared philosophy. I'm acting scared. I'm acting, will I pull my gun? Well, I'm not. I'm going to make a statement here that I think I am sick and tired more than anything else of the discussion of criminal justice reform in this country, in the sense of the way it's discussed. Liberals and the Democrats and the prosecutors who promote this, saying we do criminal justice reform. We're giving a more fair and equitable treatment to our criminals. No, you're not. And so cities like Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Portland, for those of us who've done criminal justice reform, who've worked on it, who had Donald Trump sign the First Step Act, who actually said we deal with them, they hold accountable for the actions taken. We then work to get you back into society because 95% of all people who go to jail come home. Would you not want them to actually come home with skills to actually have a job, stay out of crime, and not recidivize? Donald Trump actually did something about it and went from 50% to 12% recidivism rate when you have people go through these kind of programs. But to simply say that the height of criminal justice reform is just let them out. Don't put them on bail. Don't hold them, if they're dangerous. To say that we're not going to prosecute you, that's like bad parenting. You take a child who's never seen boundaries, you're going to have a child who does everything and believes it's okay. We're in these cities, you're raising a generation to believe everything is okay. And that's just not right, and it puts everybody at risk. And if you don't believe it, it'll hit you anywhere you can. But Matt made a great point about this. It's that idea, qualified. If you've got a bad cop, they will be prosecuted, period. But should they actually have to walk out every time they open their car door to make a stop or have somebody come at them? Are they having to work, well, does my prosecutor think this is okay? Is this the technique on how I'm taking them down? Here's something you need to be aware of. When Congress and legislative bodies start determining how officers are to affect arrest, especially techniques, you know what you're doing? You're putting the officer's life at risk. You know what you're also doing? You're going to increase the opportunity for an armed conflict, for a deadly incident, because the officer will protect themselves. And if you limit how they protect themselves, that's exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah, there's a good example of that. A couple years ago here in Alexandria, in downtown Alexandria, there was an officer who was confronting an individual, and I don't recall all of the specifics, but long and short of it was the officer got shot at, didn't shoot the individual. Nobody was hurt, thankfully, but at the end of the day, she was asked why she didn't shoot. She said she hesitated because she was second-guessing herself. And that's exactly what you get, people second-guessing. And law enforcement's dynamic. Things happen in a split second, and those things are life and death, and you can't have officers thinking, second-guessing themselves. Let me ask one other question before we have time for maybe one or two questions from the audience. The defund the movement, we're all familiar with that. Now we're familiar with campus protests, a lot of the anti-Semitic protests that are going on. A lot of those overlap the same sort of cadre of professional of agitators. But we've seen very different approaches in some college campuses. And Doug and Pam, you're both from Georgia and Florida, respectively. I think things were dealt with a little differently, perhaps.
States that don't typically have good football.
Oh, please.
That too.
He wishes he was a Florida Gator. So I was just at University of Florida.
Means more,
here we go.
Just
so
means more.
SEC, right? Doug? I was just at University of Florida's graduation, and we did not have one protester. We did not have one person scream anything, no riots, no tents, nothing. You know why? Our president, Ben Sass, said, I'm sure the famous line you've all heard now, what is it? We are not a daycare. You break the rules and you face the consequences, which was a 3-year suspension. So all of a sudden, everything stopped. And also Emory Gainey is a sheriff in Alachua County who worked with me for years as Attorney General. But, on a positive note, before we go down there, think how many people are still in law enforcement. Look all around you, Metro. So please, we've all been so negative because we're all talking about what we need to do to support our law enforcement officers. And I say this all the time. So I traveled with President Trump in 2016 before he was president, then after he was president, all over the country. What that man did backstage when no one was looking, we'd be going up, you've been there, Matt, kitchen elevators and back roads with Secret Service. he would always go up, I don't care if there were 100 people in the room, he would go up to the law enforcement officers and shake their hands and thank them for what they do. And that's what we can all still be doing, because there are still so many great men and women out there who wear the uniform, given all the risk, all the perils that we've talked about this evening. So just thank them. I don't care if they're giving you a speeding ticket. Thank them for what they do and for supporting us, especially all the heck that they're having to put up with now on these college campuses around the country. They can't even defend themselves against these people with trash cans as shields. It's crazy.
Yeah, I think if you look up Georgia State Patrol in the campus riots, I think you see that Kirby Smart, the University of Georgia football coach, found a possible linebacker. He took him out. It was the best thing. And then one, it was interesting. He just picked him up by one and just took him off. Look, you can protest all you want, and I'll fight the First Amendment. You go protest all you want, but the minute you start damaging property, the minute you start threatening other people, and your especially the anti-Semitic viral hate that is coming from pro-Hamas, let's just call them what they are. I'm not going to say they're anything else except pro-Hamas terrorist sympathizers that are doing this, because this is what's happening. But when the law enforcement are allowed to do their job and not be a daycare, it's an interesting situation, and there's just a difference in how you look at it. And you have, these are the things that support, law enforcement. I agree with Pam. Let's celebrate also the good in this as well. I forgot one thing about qualified immunity, though, that is interesting. We were on Bob Goodlatte was chairman of the Judiciary Committee a few years ago, and I was under Bob, and we had a police working group that came out of Ferguson, actually, was when this happened. Myself and Democrat, Republicans, and we did it out of the committee. And when they came to Atlanta, I had an opportunity to get the DNR folks who have the shooting simulators. If you've ever seen the shooting simulator, shoot, don't shoot kind of simulators. And I let they set it up for our members of Congress to go through. I'm not going to tell you which members, but we had Republicans and Democrats. And there were a couple of Democrats on the committee had never been through this kind of simulator. They went through the simulator. It was interesting. One shot everything. It didn't have to move. They shot it. The other one didn't shoot anything. And at the end of it, and like I said, I say this with just love, it was a situation they'd never been a part of, because we were talking about qualified immunity, talking about how with these officers. And I asked them, I said, what did you think about that? And they said, I've never thought about it this way. I've never looked at it this way. Now, unfortunately, they came back and voted a different way. But but again, how many people have ever had that situation? And especially members over there who have voting cards. They need to think about it.
Well, I think we have time for at least one or two questions. If there are any questions in the audience, please raise your hand right there.
Yes. Seeing as we have some members of Congress with us, I'm a district resident. Crime, as we've discussed in the district, is wildly out of control. The city council doesn't take it seriously. The mayor doesn't take it seriously. The attorney general, the U.S. attorney are perfectly content to let D.C. be extremely dangerous. What will you, as members of Congress, do to try to help district residents live in a safe city?
As I stated earlier, there's nothing more important than public safety and having a sense of a safe environment. It's terrible in Philadelphia, for instance, where people really feel unsafe. It's not a joke by any matters. It is a sense that people want to get an Uber immediately they walk out a door and things of that nature. And I will tell you this, it festers, right? As soon as you allow smash and grabs to take place, as soon as you allow $999 or less, you can grab and run. As soon as you allow ATVs and motorbikes to run up and down the streets, it gets worse and worse and worse. Just like the protesters, right? Let's face it. It started little encampments, chanting. Then the language got more vile, and then they got violent. And that's when it got broken up, or when they were getting dragged into Congress, thanks to some Republican members, particularly at GW, where my daughter goes to med school. It was a disgrace over there. But what we do is we did get on top of. Congress does have authority over D.C. criminal law, and we passed a bill which didn't allow the district council to alleviate all kinds of penalties, convictions for violent crimes. That was a pretty big deal. And you want to know what? You know where that came from? That came from the people. That came from the neighborhoods. That came from everybody who was pleading that this not get any worse by vote of the district council. So I think we possibly see some trends happening that way. And we have a new mayor in Philadelphia, for instance, who seems to get it, who's putting the funding back in, who's talking to the police more. As we said earlier, the social experiment, this sick, I liked how Pam added this sick social experiment is failing terribly, and it needs to be corrected. I don't mind going back to, I'm originally from New York, Rudy Giuliani, when he came in as mayor. He started with the squeegees. He stopped the squeegees, and then he moved up from there. And you want to know what? New York was unbelievably safe. People were coming up with excuses as to why it's so safe. No, because he supported the police, he had the right prosecutors, and he had the right plan.
Great point. Go ahead, sir.
One of the issues in D.C. is that in addition to the system, the entirety of the justice system, in stores in D.C., there is a system where CVS will fire an employee who tries to stop a thief from leaving with goods that are desperately needed by members of the district. And they're firing that employee because that employee is putting his life at risk and stepping in where the police can't be there. This is a known organized crime operation. The only thing CVS does is they put up the same 5 people who rob them every week, and they block them from entering the store. And the only thing Metropolitan Washington Police Department can do is when those people enter, wearing masks, of course, for COVID safety, they can turn them away. They can say you're trespassing, and they can put a trespass charge. I'm not sure the district attorney in D.C. would actually take that. What can you do as members of Congress to talk to corporate America to say there is no social justice issue here, there is just a justice issue?
I think one of the issues you're coming back here is there could be some. Again, it's not just CVS. You go to Home Depot, Walmart. I mean, all the major. Even in my state, my son used to work for Home Depot, and they told him that don't. I mean, if somebody's walking out, you don't chase them. You just get their CAG number and then you call it in. And this is in Georgia. So I mean, and again, that comes from the corporate liability side. Okay, so I mean, maybe some tort reform issues. There may be something there, the Good Samaritan law kind of thing that could be tweaked to help that going forward. I think the interesting part is what you're saying here in not just D.C. That's what I'm trying to say. It's a corporate. So corporate, but they're pressured, and again with stockholders, with all their entities, and also they have general counsels who tell them, don't do this. I mean, I remember growing up, and I used to work for a grocery store called Big Star. You came in and stole something, we saw you, we were chasing you. It was just fun. I mean, and we were sitting on them when the sheriff's department got there. I'm a country kid from North Georgia. I mean, come on. But I think but it's a bigger issue when you come on and say that you have corporate attorney and law that is now unfavorable to a safe working place, and that becomes the overriding theme here. Back to the previous question, the gentleman back there asked as well, that sort of goes along with this. When Congress did step up under some of the home rule issue and then started and backed off the criminal plan, the council also started hearing it as well, and they actually came out with some stuff that even some of the left-wing activists said you can't pass this, and they did anyway, because they do see this. They live here too. As crazy as it sounds, they do live here, and they don't like to have a gun put in their face either. And Joe Biden and the White House actually could see this. really, I think what's going to have to affect that you're starting to see in New York, you're starting to see in other places, though, and even here in D.C., is leaving the city.
And you made a good point. And to explain to everyone, you said organized crime. Well, you're thinking, well, how is walking in a CVS and taking something organized crime? Oh, it is. This isn't a mom walking in taking baby formula. This isn't a mom, we wouldn't prosecute that, taking diapers because she couldn't afford. These are organized criminals. They're rings. They're funding. They're going and stealing a ton of stuff. They're reselling it on the black market, and they're using it to fund drugs and gangs. It's really gangs, I think, the main part of it. But that's why, and then you have these woke DAs who are saying, we're not going to prosecute property crimes. Well, then how do you stop the cycle of it?
Well, I have a solution for this. Instead of using RICO cases to make up fake things in the city of Atlanta, why don't you use RICO to go after these folks in other places? You want to use a true term of RICO? Let's do it actually the way it's California is the worst at this. Yeah, RICO ought to be used for something besides a political tool. But in California, we're seeing this. They're on the phone. They connect with each other. They're using radios. They go into certain places. They know they can steal up to a certain amount. And then if you've not watched it, you need to research it. Then they put it on eBay and other places, and I'm probably, I'm not a member anymore. God bless you. I'll call it, but they put it on these sites where they resell them. Yeah. And I think it's just a continuing path. And look, there's some, things that you can do, but let's go after this and quit calling it this just, smash and grab. No, they're organized. They know this is the mafia in this century.
Look, we could go on for quite a long time, but we're running out of time here, so I want to turn the microphone over to the Center for Law and Justice co-chair Pam Bondi to close this out.
Oh, thank you all for being here and supporting. It's in memory, of course, of all the great men and women in law enforcement who we've lost. We've all, I believe, known someone who we've lost in law enforcement, but it's also, I think, just as important to support those who are out there fighting every single day to keep us safe. So we can go to church, so we can go to work, so we can take our kids to school, so we can be safe. So that's why it's so important to honor all of our men and women in law enforcement who are out there fighting for us every single day. Thank you all for being here. And thank you, Matt Whitaker's back there doing a radio show on Law Enforcement Week. And thank you, Doug, and thank you, Congressman, and thank you, Scott, we're honoring you for your 20 years of service. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody.